My family called me selfish for leaving. They hid the real reason I left. I used to think silence was a kind of loyalty. I thought if I just stayed quiet long enough, if I never explained myself, the people who loved me would eventually understand on their own. I was wrong about that, the way you can only be wrong about something for years and years quietly without anyone telling you otherwise. And it took a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon, 7 years after I walked out of my parents' house with 2 suitcases and a folder of papers I never showed anyone, to finally understand just how wrong I had been. The call came while I was standing in my kitchen, slicing an onion of all things. My hand smelled like it for the rest of the day, which is strange, the details you remember. My mother's name lit up my phone screen, and my chest did that thing it still does even after all this time, that tightening, that bracing. I almost didn't answer. I want you to know that. I almost let it ring out and go to voicemail like I had 100 times before. But something in me, some old habit of hope, made me pick it up. Your father's in the hospital, she said. No hello, no how are you? It's his heart. You should come. I stood there with the knife still in my hand, onion halved on the cutting board, and I felt the strangest mixture of things. Fear, yes, real fear, because whatever else he was still my father, and some part of a daughter never fully stops loving her father, even the parts of him that hurt her. But underneath the fear was something colder, a kind of tired recognition, because I knew, even before I hung up the phone, that this wasn't really an invitation to see him. It was an invitation back into a room full of people who had spent 7 years calling me selfish, and I was about to walk into it without a single weapon except the truth, which I had been carrying, folded up small, for longer than any of them knew. I should tell you how it started, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what came before. I grew up in a house that looked from the outside like the kind of house people envied. My father built a successful contracting business from nothing, the kind of self-made story he loved to tell at dinner parties, and my mother ran the household with the precision of a woman who needed everything in its place because chaos frightened her more than cruelty ever did. I had one brother, Daniel, 3 years younger than me, and from as early as I can remember, there was a current running under our family, a current that pulled everything toward him and pushed everything away from me. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's simply what happened. Daniel got the new bike. I got my cousin's old one, spray painted so it would look newer. Daniel got to skip his chores if he had a game. I never got to skip mine, game or no game. When I brought home a report card full of A's, my father would glance at it and say, "Good, good," and go back to his newspaper. When Daniel brought home a report card with 2 C's and a B, my mother would put it on the refrigerator like a trophy, because he tried so hard, poor thing. For years, I told myself this was just how families worked. Some kids get more attention, some get less, and it evens out eventually, doesn't it? I told myself that so many times I almost believed it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known as a teenager doing my homework at the kitchen table while my brother watched television in the next room, was that the imbalance in that house wasn't emotional. It was financial. And it had a paper trail. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was the one soft place in my childhood. Her name was Ruth, and she lived 20 minutes away in a small blue house with a garden that smelled like tomatoes and mint no matter the season, or that's how I remember it, anyway. Grandma Ruth was the only person in my family who ever looked at me like I was already enough, not something to be improved or compared or measured against my brother. She used to say, "You have an old soul, Maya. Old souls carry more, but they also see more." I didn't understand what she meant until much later. I think she was trying to tell me something in her way, long before I was ready to hear it. When I was 22, fresh out of college with a mountain of ambition and no money, Grandma Ruth got sick. Pancreatic cancer, the fast kind. She was gone within 5 months. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed near the end, holding her hand, which had gone thin and papery, and she squeezed my fingers with more strength than I expected and said, "I've taken care of you, Maya. Don't let them tell you otherwise." At the time I thought she meant emotionally. I thought she meant the years of birthday cards with $5 bills tucked inside, the sweaters she knitted, the summers the first spent at her house escaping the tension at home. I didn't understand what she really meant until 3 years later, and by then everything had already been rearranged without my knowledge. Grandma Ruth passed in October. By December, my parents had stopped mentioning her name at dinner, as if grief had a shelf life in that house and hers had already expired. I assumed there had been a will, the way families assume such things exist without ever seeing them. I assumed whatever she left, if she left anything, had gone to my mother, since Ruth had no other children. I never asked. Asking about money in my family was treated like a small act of violence, something that revealed you as greedy, as ungrateful, as exactly the kind of person my mother always seemed to suspect I secretly was. I was 24 when I noticed the first strange thing, though I didn't understand its significance for a long time. My father had always kept a locked filing cabinet in the corner of his home office, an old gray metal thing with a dent in the bottom drawer from when Daniel, as a kid, had kicked it during a tantrum. I was in there one afternoon looking for my birth certificate because I needed it for a passport application, and my mother had told me it would be in the top drawer, the one that wasn't locked. It wasn't there. But in my search I noticed the bottom drawer, usually locked, was slightly open. Just an inch. Enough that the corner of a manila folder was visible, sticking out like it had been shoved back in a hurry. I want to be honest with you. I almost didn't look. That's the person I was back then, the person who had been trained her whole life not to look, not to ask, not to want things that weren't already being offered to her. But something about the way that folder was jammed in there, carelessly, unlike my father's usual precision, made my stomach turn in a way I couldn't explain. So I pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. Inside were bank statements. Not my father's business accounts, which I recognized from years of watching him do paperwork at that same desk. These were personal statements from an account I'd never heard of, opened in my grandmother's name, and beneath them, a single sheet of paper that made my hands go cold. It was a transfer authorization form, dated 4 months after Grandma Ruth's funeral, moving what remained of her estate, just over $218,000, into an account jointly held by my mother and my brother Daniel. Not my mother and my father. Not my mother alone. My mother and Daniel. I didn't understand it then, not fully. I told myself there could be an explanation. Maybe Grandma Ruth wanted it that way. Maybe there was a will I'd never seen that named Daniel specifically, for reasons that made sense to everyone but me. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, and went looking for my birth certificate somewhere else. I told myself it wasn't my business. That's the sentence I repeated to myself for months afterward, on nights when I couldn't sleep, staring at my ceiling. It's not my business. It's not my business. Even though some part of me already knew that if it truly wasn't my business, I wouldn't have needed to convince myself of it so many times. It took another year for the second piece to fall into place, and when it did, it wasn't an accident. It was a mistake on someone else's part, the kind of small human error that ends up unraveling a much bigger lie. I was 25, working my first real job at a marketing firm downtown, finally starting to build something that felt like mine. My mother called one evening, her voice bright in that particular way it got when she wanted something. She asked if I could stop by the house and pick up some mail that had been sent to their address by mistake, some paperwork from my old bank that I'd apparently still had linked to their address from college. I agreed, mostly because I still, even then, wanted so badly for these small errands to be proof that I still belonged there, that I still mattered enough to be asked for things. When I arrived, my mother was out, some appointment she'd forgotten to mention, and my father let me in with the distracted politeness he reserved for me, the kind you'd give a neighbor rather than a daughter. The mail was on the kitchen counter, and as I sorted through it looking for mine, a bank statement addressed to Daniel slipped out of a stack and fell to the floor. I bent to pick it up, and my eyes caught the balance before I could stop myself. It wasn't the amount that stunned me so much as the account name printed at the top, the same account number I remembered from the folder in my father's office, the one jointly held by my mother and Daniel. The current balance was down to just under $60,000. In under 2 years, they had gone through more than 3/4 of what should have been my grandmother's estate. And I had never received so much as a phone call telling me she had left anything behind at all. I didn't say anything that day. I want you to understand how hard that was, to stand in that kitchen with my hands trembling slightly, to hand my father the mail, to smile and say something forgettable about traffic on the drive over, and to walk back out to my car and sit there for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I wasn't ready yet. I didn't have proof, not real proof, not proof anyone else would believe over the version of events my parents had spent a lifetime perfecting. The version where Daniel struggled and needed help and I, successful and stable, needed nothing from anyone. That was the story they told at every family gathering, in every conversation with relatives, The story that had calcified over years into something that felt like fact even to me sometimes. Maya's fine. Maya doesn't need anything. Maya's always been so independent. It sounded like a compliment. It took me years to realize it had actually been a kind of erasure, a way of quietly writing me out of any conversation about what I might be owed, what I might deserve, what might rightfully have come to me. I started paying attention after that day in the kitchen. Quietly. Carefully. I want to be clear that I wasn't plotting revenge, not yet, not really. I was trying to understand my own family, trying to figure out if what I'd seen was an aberration or a pattern. And the more I watched, the more the pattern revealed itself, the way a photograph slowly develops in a darkroom, shapes emerging from what looked like nothing. I noticed that Daniel, who had struggled to hold a job for more than 8 months at a time, somehow always had money. A new truck. A down payment on a condo that seemed impossible on his income. Vacations posted on his social media that didn't match the modest salary he complained about at every family dinner. When I gently asked my mother about it once, phrased as innocently as I could manage, she said, "Your brother's had a hard time. We help him when we can. You've never needed that kind of help." There it was again. That phrase. You've never needed that kind of help. As if my not needing help and my not receiving what was rightfully mine were the same thing. As if my independence had somehow disqualified me from an inheritance that had nothing to do with independence at all. The last piece, the piece that finally broke something loose in me, came 8 months before I left. I was 26. My mother asked me to help clean out Grandma Ruth's old blue house, since it had finally sold after sitting empty for 2 years. Another detail I hadn't known, that they'd kept the house rather than selling it right away. I spent a Saturday afternoon in those familiar rooms, breathing in the ghost of tomatoes and mint that no longer grew there, and in the back of a closet, behind a stack of old quilts, I found a shoebox. Inside were letters. Grandma Ruth had written them, dated across the final year of her life, though she'd apparently never sent them. Some were addressed to my mother. A few were addressed to me. I sat on the floor of that empty closet and read every single one, my heart pounding harder with each page. In the letters to my mother, her tone grew increasingly firm, almost pleading in places. She wrote about wanting her estate divided equally between her grandchildren, not simply handed to my mother to distribute at her own discretion. She wrote in one letter dated just 3 weeks before she died, "I know you believe Daniel needs more, but Maya has earned what she has through her own hands, and that does not mean she deserves less of what is rightfully hers. Please do not let old habits decide this for you." And then in the letter addressed directly to me, the one she must have written and never had the chance, or perhaps never found the courage to send, she wrote something that I have read so many times since that I could recite it in my sleep. She wrote, "Maya, if you are reading this and I am not there to explain, know that I set aside a portion of what I have for you directly, separate from anything I've left your mother to manage. I did this because I have watched you your whole life carry more than your share of this family's weight without complaint, and I wanted just once for something to come to you simply because you deserved it, not because you earned it through struggle. I love you exactly as you are. I hope one day the rest of them see what I see." There had been a separate provision, something meant only for me, and it had never come. I didn't confront anyone that day. I couldn't. I sat in that closet for almost an hour, letters spread across my lap, crying in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry in years, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and endless, the kind of crying that comes from finally understanding something you'd suspected all along but had talked yourself out of believing. When I finally stood up, I put the letters in my bag along with a few other papers I found nearby, insurance documents, an old handwritten list in Grandma Ruth's looping cursive that appeared to be an accounting of her assets, numbers I didn't yet fully understand but that I knew instinctively I needed to keep. I left the family 2 months later. Not dramatically. There was no screaming match, no slammed door, no scene at a holiday dinner the way you might expect from a story like this. I simply started pulling back slowly, the way you'd remove a splinter you'd let sit too long, carefully, so as not to leave the tip behind. I stopped attending every gathering. I answered fewer calls. I moved across the state for a promotion that was real, but that I also used, if I'm honest, as a kind of shield, a legitimate reason to put distance between myself and a house full of people who had taken something from me and never once considered that I might notice. They called it selfish. That was the word my mother used first, in a voicemail I still have saved. her voice tight with something that sounded almost like fear underneath the anger. "You're being selfish, Maya. This family needs you and you're just leaving." Daniel called it worse. In a text message I also kept calling me cold, calling me ungrateful, telling me our parents had given me everything and this was how I repaid them. Even my aunt, my father's sister, someone I'd always liked, sent a card that Christmas with a short note inside that said, "Family isn't something you walk away from when it's inconvenient." None of them knew what I knew. None of them asked why. They had already decided, long before I left, exactly who I was, and my leaving simply confirmed the story they'd already been telling about me for years. I let them believe it. I want you to understand that this was a choice, not a failure of courage, though it took me a long time to see the difference myself. I let them believe I was selfish because the alternative, standing in front of my entire family and accusing my parents of taking money that belonged to me, felt like something I wasn't ready to survive. I needed time. I needed to understand what I actually had legally before I said a single word. So I took the letters and the handwritten list, and the copies I'd carefully made of those bank statements over the following months whenever I found excuses to visit that house, and I built slowly, quietly, without anyone's knowledge, a case. I found a lawyer 2 years after I left, a woman named Patricia Alvarez who specialized in estate disputes, recommended to me by a coworker who'd gone through something similar with her own family. I remember sitting across from her in her office, sliding the shoebox of letters across the desk, my hands shaking slightly, and she read through everything without saying a word for almost 20 minutes. When she finally looked up, she said, "This is a strong case, Maya, but I want you to understand something first. Cases like this don't just cost money in legal fees. They cost you your family, whatever's left of it. Are you prepared for that?" I told her I already didn't have much of a family left to lose. I believed that when I said it. I'm not sure I still do. Patricia explained things to me slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something to someone standing at the edge of a decision they didn't yet fully understand. My grandmother's will, the official one, the one that had gone through probate, had indeed named my mother as executor with broad discretion over distribution, which was likely why my parents felt confident they could quietly redirect things without consequence. But the letters, especially the one addressed directly to me, combined with the handwritten accounting list, which Patricia had a forensic accountant examine and confirmed was in my grandmother's own handwriting and dated, suggested a clear intent that had never been honored. There was also buried in that shoebox something I hadn't fully understood the significance of when I first found it. A separate, smaller account statement, one that predated the main estate, showing a modest trust, just over $40,000, that Grandma Ruth had opened years earlier, specifically in my name, that had never once been mentioned to me and that, according to Patricia's investigation, had been quietly drained down to almost nothing over the same period. Daniel's joint account had been growing. That was the moment the case stopped being about the larger estate, about fairness in some abstract sense, and became something much more specific and much harder to swallow. They hadn't just redirected an inheritance my grandmother wanted split evenly. They had taken money that had my name on it. Money that had been mine legally the entire time. Patricia and I spent the better part of a year building the case properly, quietly, without a single word to my family. I learned things in that year I never expected to learn: how to read a forensic accounting report, how transfer authorizations can be challenged when signatures don't match sworn deposition dates, how patiently the law moves when patience is exactly what you need. I kept working my regular job the entire time. I kept my apartment simple, my life ordinary, on the outside indistinguishable from any other 28-year-old woman living quietly in a city 300 miles from the family that had, in their minds, already written her off as selfish and gone. What almost nobody knew, not even Patricia at first, was that I wasn't doing this for the money, not really. I mean, of course the money mattered. $40,000 is not nothing, and neither is a fair share of $218,000. But somewhere in that year of quiet research, of reading and rereading my grandmother's letters until the paper softened at the creases, what I actually wanted became clear to me. I wanted someone to say it, out loud, in front of everyone who had called me selfish. I wanted my mother to say in a room full of people that she had known the entire time exactly why I left. The hospital call came the week the case was finally ready to move forward. Patricia had, at my request, held off filing anything until I felt ready, and I hadn't been ready, not fully, Until that Tuesday afternoon with the onion still on my cutting board and my mother's voice in my ear telling me my father's heart was failing. There was something almost unbearably ironic about the timing, and for a moment standing in my kitchen, I wondered if some part of the universe had decided the waiting was over. I drove home 3 days later. I want to describe that drive honestly because it wasn't cinematic, it wasn't dramatic music and steely resolve the whole way. I cried twice. I pulled over once because my hands were shaking too badly to keep driving safely. I called Patricia from a gas station parking lot just to hear her calm voice remind me that I didn't have to do anything I wasn't ready to do, that the papers could wait, that I could simply go be a daughter for a few days if that's what I needed, and decide the rest later. I appreciated that she gave me the option. I think she knew, the way lawyers who've done this work long enough often know, that I wasn't going to take it. My father survived as it turned out. A cardiac event, serious but survivable, 3 days in the hospital, and then home with a fistful of new prescriptions and a diet he complained about immediately. I sat with him in that hospital room for 2 of those 3 days, and something in me softened despite everything, watching him look small in that bed, hooked up to machines that beeped quietly in the background. I held his hand the way I'd once held my grandmother's, and for a moment I let myself just be his daughter, nothing more complicated than that. But families don't stay in hospital rooms. They go home, and home was where the rest of it happened. It was 6 days after his discharge. At a dinner my mother insisted on hosting to bring everyone back together after the scare, that I finally did what I had spent nearly 3 years preparing to do. Daniel was there with his girlfriend, my aunt and uncle had come, and my mother had cooked more food than the table could comfortably hold, the way she always did when she wanted a gathering to feel like more than it was. I remember the smell of roasted chicken and the sound of my father's careful, medicated laughter, and I remember thinking, this is the last ordinary dinner this family will ever have, and no one else in this room knows it yet. I waited until dessert, not for drama, but because I genuinely wasn't sure I'd be able to eat if I did it any earlier, and I wanted selfishly perhaps to have one more normal meal with them before everything changed. When my mother started clearing plates, I asked if everyone could stay at the table a few more minutes. I said I had something I needed to share. My voice, I remember, came out steadier than I expected, which surprised me almost as much as it seemed to surprise them. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that because I know how these stories are often imagined, shouting, thrown accusations, someone storming out. None of that happened. I simply reached into my bag and set the shoebox on the table, right there among the dessert plates, and I said, I found these in Grandma Ruth's closet almost 3 years ago. I think it's time everyone saw them. My mother's face changed before she even opened the box. That was the detail that stayed with me longest, actually not what she said afterward but the way her expression shifted in that first half second, a kind of recognition, the look of someone who has spent years dreading a specific moment and finally watching it arrive. I read the letters aloud. Not all of them, just the 2 that mattered most, the one to my mother about wanting the estate split evenly, and the one addressed to me, the one where Grandma Ruth said she'd set aside a portion just for me, separate from what she'd left my mother to manage. I watched my father's face as I read, confusion at first, then something more complicated because I don't believe even now that he had been as deeply involved as my mother was, though he had certainly known enough to stay quiet. I watched Daniel's girlfriend glance at him with an expression I couldn't quite read, and I watched Daniel himself stare down at his plate, not meeting anyone's eyes. Then I pulled out the handwritten list and the bank statements, laid them side by side on the table, and explained calmly, the way Patricia had helped me practice explaining it, exactly what they showed. A trust in my name, opened when I was 19, worth just over $40,000 at the time of Grandma Ruth's death. Drained over the 2 years following her passing, to a balance of $612. Transfers that matched, almost to the week, large withdrawals from the joint account held by my mother and Daniel. I'm not here to destroy this family, I said, and I meant it, even as I said it, even knowing what I was about to do next might feel like exactly that to everyone at that table. I'm here because I spent 7 years being called selfish for leaving, and not one person in this house ever asked me why. You just decided you already knew. I left because I found out my own grandmother's dying wish for me had been quietly erased, and nobody planned on telling me. I left because staying meant pretending I didn't know what I knew. And I am done pretending. My mother tried at first to say it was a misunderstanding, that the money had gone toward helping Daniel because he needed it more, that I'd never asked, that I'd always seemed like I didn't need anything from anyone. I let her finish. And then I said the thing I had rehearsed more than any other line in the 3 years leading up to that dinner. I said, "You didn't get to decide I didn't need it. Grandma Ruth decided I did. She wrote it down. She set it aside herself. You just never told me it existed." The silence after that was the longest I have ever sat inside. My father, still pale from his hospital stay, looked at my mother in a way I had genuinely never seen before, somewhere between disbelief and something closer to grief, as if he too was only now understanding the full shape of what had happened in his own house, under his own roof for years without his full knowledge. Daniel finally looked up, and what he said surprised me. He didn't defend himself. He said quietly, "I didn't know about the trust. I swear I didn't know that part." I believed him, actually. I think Daniel had been handed money for years without ever being told exactly where all of it had come from. Another kind of quiet manipulation, one that had made him complicit without ever making him fully informed. I told them the case was already filed. That wasn't strictly true, not yet, but it was close enough to true, and I wanted them to understand this wasn't a conversation that would simply end when everyone went home and calmed down. I told them Patricia would be in touch. I told them I wasn't interested in taking Daniel's home or his truck or ruining his life, but that I would be pursuing what my grandmother had specifically set aside for me with interest, and that if they wanted to avoid a long legal process, we could resolve it directly, family to family, lawyer to lawyer, without turning it into the kind of public mess that destroys people. I left before dessert was served. I hugged my father on my way out, gently, mindful of his heart, and I told him I loved him, which was true, uncomplicated by everything else that had happened. I did not hug my mother. I simply said goodnight, picked up my shoebox and walked out to my car, and I sat there in the driveway for a long moment, engine off, listening to the quiet, waiting to see if my hands would start shaking the way they had in that gas station parking lot. They didn't. That, more than anything else that happened that night, told me I had done the right thing at the right time in the right way. What happened over the following months unfolded slower than any movie would have you believe, the way real vindication almost always does. There was no dramatic courtroom scene. My mother, through her own lawyer, ultimately agreed to settle rather than fight a case that Patricia assured me, and I came to believe myself, would not have gone well for her in front of a judge. The trust that had been drained was repaid, with interest, over an 18-month period. It didn't restore what those years had cost me emotionally, but it restored something, and there is a particular kind of peace in watching a number on a page finally match what was always supposed to be true. My father called me a month after that dinner, alone, without my mother on the line. He told me he hadn't known the full extent of what had happened, that he'd trusted my mother to handle the family finances, without asking too many questions. A trust, he admitted quietly, he now understood had allowed things to happen that he wished he'd caught sooner. He apologized, not eloquently, not the way you'd want in a story like this, but honestly, in the halting way of a man unused to admitting fault. I told him I appreciated it. I meant that too. My mother and I did not speak for almost a year after that dinner. When we finally did, it wasn't a dramatic reconciliation. It was a stiff, careful phone call on my birthday, her voice smaller than I remembered it, asking how I was, not apologizing exactly, but not defending herself either, which from her was its own kind of admission. We are still, even now, rebuilding something that may never look like what either of us imagined a mother and daughter should have. But it is honest, at least in a way our relationship never was before, and I have come to believe that honest and imperfect is worth infinitely more than smooth and false. Daniel and I talk more than I expected we would. He reached out first, actually, a few months after everything settled, and told me he'd started asking our mother more questions about money, about the years he'd been given things without understanding where they came from, and that some of what he'd learned had made him deeply uncomfortable with his own past silence. He offered more than once to pay some of it back himself, out of his own pocket, separate from the settlement. I told him he didn't need to, that he'd been a kind of casualty in this too, just a different kind than me. I think he needed to hear that more than I realized. I think about Grandma Ruth often, more now than I did even in the years right after she died. I think about her sitting in that hospital bed, squeezing my hand, telling me she'd taken care of me, and I understand now what she meant, and how much courage it must have taken her to try to protect me from inside a family that had already decided, long before I did, what my role was supposed to be. I think about the letter she wrote and never sent, the one that sat folded in a shoebox in a closet for 3 years before I found it, and I wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't gone to clean out that house that particular Saturday, if I'd sent someone else, if the closet had been emptied by anyone but me. But I did find it, and I think in some quiet, unprovable way she knew I would. I am 31 now. I have my own life 300 miles from the house I grew up in, a life built slowly and carefully out of the wreckage of everything I once assumed a family was supposed to be. I still get called selfish sometimes by people who only know the outline of the story, the leaving without the reason. I have stopped needing them to understand. That was, I think, the final piece of my own healing, realizing that vindication doesn't require an audience, that the truth is true whether or not everyone in the room agrees to see it. What I hope, if you've stayed with me this long, is that you understand something I wish someone had told me years earlier. Quiet does not mean weak. Leaving does not mean selfish. And sometimes the people who call you cold are simply the ones most uncomfortable with how clearly you finally learn to see them. I did not raise my voice at that dinner table. I did not need to. The truth, laid out calmly in my grandmother's own handwriting, was louder than anything I could have shouted. I keep the shoebox still on a shelf in my closet, letters and all. Sometimes on hard days I take it down and read her words again, the ones that were meant for me long before I ever found them. I did this because I have watched you your whole life carry more than your share of this family's weight without complaint, and I wanted just once, for something to come to you simply because you deserved it. I think that's what this whole story was really about, in the end. Not the money, though the money mattered. Not even the confrontation, though I needed it more than I let myself admit at the time. It was about someone, somewhere, finally seeing me clearly, and loving me enough to try to make sure that truth outlived her. It took 3 years after her death for that truth to reach me, and 7 years after I left for the rest of my family to finally hear it too. But it arrived. Quietly on its own time, exactly the way she must have known somehow that it eventually would.